Welcome to the Six Hats podcast, where I, Dr. Shami, a lifestyle and nutritional medicine family doctor, will talk about how women strive to find balance each day by juggling their six roles, being a woman, mother, daughter, partner, business owner, and professional. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Six Hats podcast. Now, today we're joined by the incredible Louisa Sikaris, an exercise physiologist at Kieser, who is passionate about the power of strength training to transform lives. Now, Louisa believes in the profound impact of movement, not just for physical health, but for empowering people to make lasting positive changes. So in this episode, we'll be diving into how exercise physiology can help those living with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, breaking down the science, the benefits, and the small practical steps that can make a big difference. Excellent. Thank you so much, Louisa, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Shani.
Excellent. So a great place to start, and I know you see so many patients with fibro or chronic fatigue, and so do I. So I'd love to start with this question. For someone living with fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue, exercise can feel overwhelming. So how do you approach movement in a way that feels safe and sustainable for them?
That's a great question. And I'm not going to lie, it's a hell of a balance. And it takes some time to figure out what that balance is going to be from one individual to another. And that's the truth of it. So everything that I say today is going to be on an individual basis. I think first and foremost, when we talk about exercise, the idea of exercise is to help people with capacity building. You know, it's about helping out with the perceptions of pain. It's about helping out with the perceptions of tiredness. But also it's about helping out with people's self-care. And self-care doesn't mean to shy away from exercise, but it also means to do it with a balanced approach.
Amazing. Can we talk more about capacity? What do you mean by capacity?
Yeah, so when we're looking at capacity, I have done a little bit of research for this podcast today to be able to nerd out with you.
Excellent, Louisa. Go for it. We love it.
So when we're talking about capacity, a lot of the time when we're talking about this, we're talking about, aerobic capacity or strength or perceptions on how we're going to get through the everyday, really. Okay, so one thing that we've had a look at is exercise helps you to regulate energy production. And in specifics, it helps to reduce something called post-exertional malaise, which is that feeling where you feel really exhausted after you're doing exercise, or that discomfort that people feel. So there was a study that was done in 2023, so not that far away from today, where it was in the Journal of Clinical Medicine. And they found that graded exercise-based therapies actually help to improve mitochondrial function and reduce oxidative stress levels with people, leading to better energy production. So that sounds like a pretty good explanation of what capacity building would be. Now, the layman's terms to explain exactly what I said would be that people with chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, their cells struggle with producing energy efficiently. And we call this a dysfunctional energy metabolism. So what we find is that low intensity, consistent movement helps to train the body and use energy more effectively without affecting issues such as trigger crashes or those boom bust cycles.
Amazing. I loved how you mentioned mitochondria. I talk a lot about mitochondrial dysfunction in my clinic for my patients. And for those listeners who are not familiar with the term, these are just cells that are like the factories that produce energy, which is ATP. And I often say to patients, oxygen and food gets converted into a couple of steps, actually much more complex than that, but we've simplified it through various cycles that release ATP, which is energy. And it all happens in the mitochondria. And that is key to support when it comes to energy, exercise tolerance. And it can actually be affected by so many things, from viruses to heavy metals to toxins to insulin resistance, which is poor sugar metabolism. So everything actually plays a role here. But I love how exercise, and this is what we're going to focus on, how exercise supports mitochondria. And we've always known this, the more you exercise, the more mitochondria you make, which makes you got more energy as well. But it's almost like the chicken and the egg. How do we begin? So if someone's really tired, this is where I'd love to dive into now. How do we gain more energy? But there's a massive block in even moving.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not going to lie, once again, it's hard. And I think it's really important to recognize that what we're talking about is a demand of energy to help fix an energy requirement issue or a pain perception issue, to go through discomfort in order to build someone's capacity to how they experience pain. So it is tough. And I think it's important to recognize, that you need to start slow. This is not stuff that we change within a week. This is going to be something that happens over, hopefully, like actually a good duration of time, up to 12 weeks, to really find out what's going to be effective for you, which is how we find out the effectiveness of most exercise intervention training that we do. But look, in terms of, making sure that you're keeping a balanced approach with it, you don't want to enter things like boom bust cycles. And what I mean by that is going too hard too soon, where you exhaust yourself to a point where you're having symptoms and then you have to do symptom management on top of that. So that's the last thing that you want. So I think it's really important to have an exercise response and to make sure that you're keeping tabs on that. And furthermore, from there, wherever possible, to work on symptom management throughout this experience, as well as how you're progressing functionally. So, what I mean by that is you're going to a place where you can exercise or do your strength training, for example, and you're able to consistently increase the weight, most sessions that you're going through and gradually make those improvements. But then all of a sudden, you've been making progression after progression, and you hit a space where you're feeling, actually, I'm starting to feel a bit overloaded in the everyday, and my quality of life has started to reduce again. So, really, capacity building is about improving function, but it's making sure that we can keep it in a maintenance cycle and a healthy response to the body.
I love that. I love that. I want to dive into perception because perception of pain is so crucial here in terms of what are the barriers to actually starting movement. So it can be perception of pain, the fear, what would happen. What's your experience in managing someone with a lot of fear around even beginning that program?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, to be honest with you, it's the point where a lot of people who are living with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, it could be a bit of a relationship burner with health professionals. And that is because people get told, it's all about your perception. It's also that perception is what you actually experience. So yes, you've got a higher sensitivity level to pain, but that doesn't mean the pain's not real and you're experiencing it. Now, the tricky thing when it comes to pain is it's actually a really important thing for the body, especially when we're looking at, homeostasis and making sure that the body's protected. And it tells us a lot of really important information like, hey, you're in trouble here, something's going wrong. But the trick about pain, and this is why we're talking about perception here, is sometimes it means damage is occurring at the body. And sometimes it also means that there isn't damage occurring to the body as well. And that's where those issues of sensitivity come into that, and why a lot of people choose to do exercise, because it's almost like habituation training. It helps you to experience another level of discomfort. And ultimately, like that study suggests, you walk away and your pain perception actually improves. So what might have been a 4 out of 10 when you entered, your training session one day, a few weeks later, it goes down to a 2, hopefully.
That's amazing. That's awesome. I'm going to move on to my next question. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about strength training and chronic conditions like fibromyalgia, and how can the right approach help manage symptoms?
I think there's a really, really common phrase that people use all the time in the exercise industry, which is no pain, no gain.
Yes. Oh my God, I heard that so many times. Wow, so true.
This one, for people living with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, is this one's off the cards. You're allowed a hall pass on this one, okay? And that's because ultimately, we know that graded exercise exposure is very important. And we know that paced and personalized programs are absolutely crucial as well. So that's important. The other thing is to do with intensity. And with a lot of the research that's out currently, It's suggesting that lower intensity exercise is probably the most supportive of people with those, benefits for exercise. So supervised programs also can help with the effectiveness and to avoid the crashes that people might experience whilst they're still trying to improve that idea of function that we talked about earlier.
Amazing, amazing. So where do you start so if someone comes to see you, may have not exercised at all, got the diagnosis of fibromyalgia, where do you start? What does a consult look like?
Yeah, so if you were to come in and see myself, the start of the session would always be to gather information about yourself. Like tell me, what has been your story up to this point and allow yourself to talk about, what are the things that caused aggravation or things that caused crashes in the past? What are things that you've been able to maintain? Sometimes we even dive into a little bit about your diet, a little bit about, your sleep cycles and things like that, so we can get an overall picture of how you're going. And then from there, what we generally tend to do is we do some sorts of objectives, objective measures, but pretty much what it is find out where the baselines are for a lot of things that we're wanting to test. So, for example, it might be, what is your capacity of being able to sit and stand from a chair over the duration of 30 seconds currently? And how fatigued do you feel afterwards? Or it could be something quite a lot more involved where people do body compositional scale testing. Now, this is interesting information because we're talking here about capacity building and function. And what we know is the more lean muscle mass that you have and the better off your entire metabolism sits on the everyday, the better you're probably going to perceive and manage your symptoms with living with these conditions.
I loved you mentioned that because I'm dying to sort of ask your opinion on how important nutrition is in managing it. And because from an integrative perspective, I have many patients with fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, we always talk about nutrition, we always talk about insulin resistance, and they always feel, wow, what a difference it's made when we approach that. And huge, huge success in terms of elevation of energy, reduction in inflammation. And I do educate a lot. And of course, everyone's got a really important message to say. Everyone's on their own journey, exactly what you said. You could have chronic fatigue for 20 years, which will be totally managed differently to someone who's had it for a couple of months. So we're so aware every journey is unique. However, it's really important to look at these practical strategies that has evidence behind it and can really, really help. So what's your opinion on nutrition and lifestyle?
Yeah, it's honestly not something that I go into great detail with my consultations, but I actually have noticed quite a bit of a trend with the patients that I see with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. Now, the people who come in and they're doing that initial consultation where, I'm finding out what their diet looks like. And in general, they're having lots of high glycemic index foods. So things that cause a lot of, quick, rapid energy uptake in the body, but it doesn't sustain itself versus people who try diets. Once again, this is definitely to do with not doing everything all at once and graduated, but people who have those lower GI foods that are coming through and more sustained energy release throughout the body, they generally feel that their symptoms are much better managed. And it can be as simple as making a few dietary changes. It doesn't mean that you need to rewrite an entire, diet. But what it could mean is, okay, how am I starting my day? Or what sort of sustainable energy sources am I choosing throughout my day to keep my blood glucose level at a sustained level? So my blood sugar levels aren't going up and down throughout the day, because of course that's going to affect anyone's energy perceptions, let alone someone already dealing with chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia.
Amazing. I'm so glad. And I'm going to add a few more things, the importance of sleep hygiene. So important. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think people who are diagnosed or have, potential diagnosis of chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, it's a tough hand to be dealt. And the toughest part about living with any chronic condition is that it impacts all areas of your health. It's the physical health, which is obviously what we've talked about a lot today, being diet and exercise, but it's also about your mental health and your social health and keeping things that you need to be doing in the everyday at a sustainable level. So really, like, it's multifaceted. It
Mm.
is really the ongoing issue here.
Amazing, amazing. And my last question for listeners who want to start moving but feel stuck, whether due to pain, fatigue, or fear, what are three simple, practical steps they can take today to begin their journey? Louisa.
If I were to narrow it down to three, I want to keep it simple. So you're going to remember it after listening to this podcast. First one is paced and personalized programs. Okay. Something that you're going to get off an Instagram reel or something like that probably isn't going to work for you from day one. Okay. So try to find the right advice. The second thing is try to get a low intensity in a supervised program, because we know that these things are really important for keeping the maintenance and your adherence to things, but also avoids those boom crash cycles that people will often experience. And then the last thing is strength training can be an excellent choice when we're looking at types of exercise for chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, but only if they're tailored through an individualized tolerance. So if you go too hard on these things, that pain, no gain, it doesn't work for you. So it isn't about pushing through. It's about working with your body. That's really important. And it's about the right movement at the right pace can rebuild your energy, can reduce your pain, and ultimately improve your quality of life.
Amazing, really amazing strategies. I'm curious, in your experience, what's a patient's journey like? When do they start seeing progress? Let's give some hope to the honest.
Yeah, absolutely. With the patients that come into my practice, I feel like the first few weeks is our investigative period. Okay. We're going to try things and we're going to build them up. And sometimes people turn around to me and they say, "Hey, Louisa, the last session that we went through, I loved it. And at the time of the session, I felt like I wasn't pushed too hard. But if the next day or in the afternoon, I felt so much like a wave of fatigue over me." And I go, okay, so the perception within the session time might be also different to the symptoms you get afterwards. So this can take a few weeks to really find out if what sort of intensity that we can work to. And sometimes in a really great instance, someone will say, "Louisa, it felt great. Let's hit it a little bit harder next time." I go, "Okay, that's awesome. Let's go with that." To see if a program is effective, a lot of research studies will do 12 weeks. And so if I'm looking at something like that body compositional scale, or if I did a questionnaire with you of how you're perceiving pain or fatigue at the start, usually 3 months will give us a really good indicator of when we can start saying, yep, this is most likely due to the things that we did within that program. Yes, this is probably meaning that these positive outcomes are due to this. So honestly, to begin with, it feels like a long time, which is 12 weeks, but most people start getting an idea by about 6.
Amazing. That's so good to know. Thank you so much for your time today, Louisa. It's really inspiring, and I hope inspires many to start moving. And I think that that's really a message for us, but it's really important to be guided by professionals as well. I really want to add that in. Amazing. So, Louisa, where can people find you?
So, Shami, I work at Kieser Heidelberg. So, I work at a training center or a training floor where people do mostly isolated strengthening exercises, but that's not all exercise physiologists here are limited to. We do all variations of different programs. So, Kieser is a really great place to start because we've got lots of different health professionals here who can help guide you to whatever you can start off with.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Louisa. Remember that this is general advice only. Please see your healthcare professional for more information. So what's your take-home message today? Remember, it's all about progress and not perfection. And are you suffering from stress? Visit the Usawa Learning Hub on usawa.com.au for more resources on how to de-stress, re-energize, and reclaim your health. Enjoy the journey.